The tent was still standing when they found it, 26 days after 9 hikers pitched it on a Ural mountainside in February 1959. It had been sliced open from inside in the dark, in minus 25 degrees Celsius cold, by people who then walked away from their only shelter without their boots. What searchers found afterward, crushed ribs with no bruising, a missing tongue, clothing that tested radioactive, never matched the explanation the Soviet government eventually filed and sealed for 30 years. The mountain's old name, given by locals long before any of this, translates to something like Dead Mountain. There's a case file in a regional Russian archive that was sealed for 30 years, full of photographs nobody outside the investigation was meant to see, and a death the state never fully explained. I found it the way most people do now, looking for something else entirely, a passing reference to old Ural folklore, and falling down a completely different hole instead. The deeper I went, the less the official explanation held together, and the more I read, the more I kept landing on the same question. What actually happened on that slope? And why did the people closest to the answer spend 30 years saying almost nothing about it? Here's where it starts. February 1959. 9 experienced hikers, students and recent graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, led by a meticulous 23-year-old named Igor Dyatlov, set out on a winter trek toward a peak in the northern Urals, a route classified as a Grade 3 expedition, demanding but well within the group's collective experience. They were skilled. They were careful, the kind of careful that comes from respecting exactly how unforgiving the terrain could be. Several had completed treks far harder than this one was supposed to be, and Dyatlov himself had a reputation for methodical planning that bordered on obsessive. They kept a shared journal, the kind of mundane record 9 tired people leave behind without thinking twice, full of complaints about the cold, sketches, inside jokes, a satirical camp newspaper they wrote together for fun, and one passing reference to a snowman, supposedly nearby, an old piece of local folklore, tossed off the way exhausted people toss off jokes around a fire. Nobody writing that line believed it would become one of the last things any of them ever put down on paper. They made their final camp on the slope of a mountain the local Mansi people had named centuries earlier, long before any Soviet institute existed to send students there. Translated, the name means something close to Dead Mountain. The Mansi avoided it, and not casually. Soviet ethnographers had recorded the specific warning decades before any of this happened, the kind of detail that gets dismissed as folklore right up until the moment it doesn't. Whether the hikers knew the name's actual meaning before they pitched their tent, there is something the journal never says. 26 days after that camp was made, after hope was already fading among families waiting at home, search teams finally found the tent. It was half collapsed under snow but still staked firmly into the frozen ground, exactly where the group had pitched it. What stopped the searchers wasn't its position. It was its condition, cut open from the inside in several places by someone working fast in total darkness, in cold that would later be estimated at 25 degrees below zero. Inside, they found boots, coats, food supplies, still packed. Nearly everything a person would need to survive a brutal night on an exposed ridge in February, left behind, untouched, as if the 9 people who owned all of it had simply stopped needing any of it. It took several more weeks of searching to find the first bodies. 2 were discovered near a lone cedar tree at the edge of the forest, a 1.5 miles downhill from the tent, dressed only in their underwear despite the freezing temperatures. The cedar's lower branches were broken several meters up, as if someone had climbed it in a hurry, to see something from a higher vantage point perhaps, or to get away from something dangerous at ground level. The bark showed scrape marks consistent with a desperate barefoot climb. Beside the tree, the charred remains of a small fire suggested a frantic, doomed attempt to survive the night without proper clothing. Without any of the shelter, they'd cut their own way out of less than 2 hours. Earlier, by some estimates, whoever built that fire never managed to build a second one. 3 more bodies were found scattered between the cedar tree and the tent, in positions suggesting they had died attempting to return uphill, toward whatever shelter remained. One investigator who personally examined the death scene would later describe their final body postures as consistent with people who had simply collapsed while still moving forward with real purpose, not scattering in blind panic, but pushing steadily towards safety for as long as their failing bodies physically allowed them to keep going. The remaining 4 were not found until May, months later, when the spring snowmelt finally exposed a narrow ravine roughly 70 meters from the cedar tree. They had been buried under several meters of compacted snow in a frozen stream bed, dressed considerably more warmly than the others, in extra clothing apparently stripped from companions who had already died earlier that same night, layered on in a way that suggested a kind of grim, deliberate, rational decision-making, even as everything else about that night points toward the exact opposite. And it was these final 4 who ultimately turned what should have been a tragic but explainable mountaineering accident into a case file that is never, even now, fully closed. 2 of the 4 had fractured skulls. One had a chest fracture so severe that a forensic examiner would later compare the force involved to that of a high-speed car crash, and yet none of them had any visible mark on the skin above those internal breaks. No bruising, no cuts. Nothing to suggest an avalanche, a fall, or another person had physically struck them from outside. The internal damage was catastrophic and entirely real. The external cause of it simply wasn't there, anywhere in the file, then or now. One of the 4, a 20-year-old woman named Lyudmila Dubinina, was missing her tongue, her eyes, part of her lips, and some facial tissue. The official file attributed this to decomposition and scavenger activity. 3 months submerged in a mountain stream bed will do that to a body, the investigators noted, almost in passing. Not everyone who has read that same file since has come away finding the explanation complete. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, formally closed the case in May 1959 with a single, deliberately vague line: the hikers had died as a result of a compelling natural force they could not overcome. He never specified anywhere in writing what that force actually was. The file was classified almost immediately afterward, and stayed that way for nearly 30 years, through the rest of the Soviet era, through the deaths of most of the people directly involved, through several changes of leadership in Moscow that had nothing to do with 9 dead hikers, and everything to do with what closed governments instinctively choose to bury. It was finally opened only once journalists and grieving relatives began pushing hard for access, in the final years before the Soviet Union itself came apart. In the decades since, the explanations offered through official channels have ranged from the mundane to the openly strange, and none has managed to satisfy everyone who's actually read the file. The most enduring theory is also the most ordinary. A slab avalanche, a small, irregular slide of snow that didn't bury the tent so much as deform it, frightening 9 exhausted hikers into cutting their way out and fleeing downhill in the dark, rather than risk digging through a possible second collapse. It's an elegant idea precisely because it requires nothing extraordinary, just bad terrain, a poor campsite decision, and panic doing what panic does to people in the dark. Russian prosecutors reopened the case formally in 2019, the first serious re-examination in decades, and ultimately endorsed a version of this explanation, citing slope angle modelling and terrain analysis, conducted with equipment that simply didn't exist in 1959. 2 years later, a team of Swiss researchers ran their own independent simulations using crash test data, and reached a broadly similar conclusion. A compact, localized slab could account for the chest and skull fractures without requiring anything stranger than physics and an unlucky campsite, since the force involved would have been distributed across a wide area and applied slowly rather than as a single sharp impact. It's a tidy answer. It has also never quite managed to close the file the way a tidy answer is supposed to. There's a detail that rarely makes it into the avalanche version of events: the sheer distance between the abandoned tent and where the 4 most severely injured bodies were eventually found. If a slab collapse near the tent caused those specific injuries, the 4 would have needed to walk, badly broken, for hours downhill, through dense forest in total darkness, before finally collapsing in the ravine where searchers found them months later. Some defenders of the avalanche theory argue this is exactly what happened, that adrenaline and raw desperation carried badly injured people farther than seems plausible, from the comfortable distance of 65 years and a warm room. It isn't impossible. It simply isn't proven, in the way the rest of the official account tends to get presented as though it were. No search team ever found clear avalanche debris on the slope directly above the tent, despite weeks of dedicated searching in exactly that area, conducted by people who knew precisely what avalanche debris was supposed to look like after a real slide. The hikers' own ski tracks, still clearly visible in the snow when rescuers first arrived, showed all 9 walking calmly away from the tent in an orderly formation. Not scrambling, not running, not behaving the way people fleeing a genuinely collapsing slope tend to behave under that kind of immediate physical threat. And then there's the radiation. When investigators later tested clothing recovered from several of the bodies, they found trace contamination at levels measurably higher than ordinary background exposure should ever produce. The file never explains this anywhere. It simply notes it, once, in a single clinical line, and moves on, the way an investigator might note some inconvenient detail that doesn't support the conclusion already written, and quietly decide not to dwell on it any further. Other theories crowded in over the years to fill the space the avalanche explanation left wide open. Some point to a nearby Soviet missile testing range, suggesting the hikers wandered unknowingly into the path of a weapons test gone catastrophically wrong, and that the panic, the small fire, even the strange orange light independently reported by a separate group of hikers 60 kilometers away that same night, were all signs of something military, something the state had every conceivable reason to bury under a deliberately vague phrase like compelling natural force. That orange light sighting made it into Soviet meteorological records of the period, filed away as an unexplained atmospheric event and never formally cross-referenced, at least not in any document that's surfaced since, with 9 deaths happening the very same night 60 kilometers away. Others suggested a violent encounter with the Mansi themselves, perhaps hunters defending their own territory, though no evidence of any struggle, no unfamiliar tracks in the snow, and nothing missing from the campsite ever actually supported that particular version. And it was eventually set aside by both investigators and later researchers alike, more out of a total absence of evidence than any definitive disproof. And then there are the people who looked at the same 9 names, the same cut tent, the same unexplained internal injuries, and arrived somewhere considerably stranger still. A KGB cover-up. A failed experiment that went wrong in a way nobody in Moscow ever wanted documented in a file that ordinary citizens might eventually be permitted to read someday. Something that came down out of the night sky and left 9 students dead on a slope the Mansi had warned outsiders away from for generations, long before any Soviet engineering student ever pitched a tent there, without knowing what the mountain's own name actually meant. Here's what can actually be said without straying into speculation. The Soviet state had every institutional incentive to make this entire story disappear quietly, regardless of what had actually happened on that mountain that February night. The inexplicable deaths of 9 model citizens, several of them Communist Party members, the kind of disciplined, capable young people the state held up publicly as exactly what it was supposed to produce, embarrassed the system regardless of the underlying cause. Sealing a file for 30 years doesn't require any conspiracy involving lights in the sky or secret weapons. It only requires a closed government doing precisely what closed governments reliably do with anything that makes them look incompetent, or worse, complicit in something they genuinely cannot explain. That single fact, far more mundane than any flying saucer, may be the most quietly disturbing part of the entire case, because it doesn't require anyone to have done anything dramatic at all. Only to have decided that silence was administratively simpler than honesty ever would have been. The truth wasn't necessarily hidden because it was extraordinary. It may have been hidden simply because it was inconvenient. An inconvenience, inside a system built the way that one was reason enough on its own to bury it for a generation. What makes the Dyatlov file genuinely different from most cold cases isn't a shortage of evidence. It's an abundance of it, paired with evidence that stubbornly refuses to agree with itself. Investigators had photographs developed from cameras recovered intact from inside the tent, undamaged despite weeks of brutal exposure to the elements. They had the joint journal, with entries running right up to the final days, written in the easy shorthand of people who trusted each other completely. They had detailed autopsy reports, regional weather data, terrain surveys, search logs from the entire rescue effort, and testimony from dozens of people who were directly involved in the recovery, some of whom carried this case with them for the rest of their lives. Few wilderness deaths in recorded history have been documented this thoroughly, with this much surviving material left over for later researchers to comb through decade after decade. And still, 65 years later, no single account manages to explain every detail sitting in the file at once. Start with the photographs. The last roll developed from the group's cameras shows entirely ordinary expedition images, hikers laughing in the snow, building camp together, posing against the white slope. The kind of photos any group of close friends takes on any trip, never once imagining anyone would study them frame by frame 6 decades later. One frame, taken the final night or close to it, is dark and badly blurred, showing only an indistinct bright shape against total black. Some researchers argue it's simply an accidental exposure, a flash fired by mistake while someone fumbled with a camera inside a freezing tent, hands too numb from the cold to operate the controls properly, fingers slow and clumsy in a way that makes simple mechanical mistakes far more likely than usual. Others note that a separate group of hikers, camped roughly 60 kilometers south that same night, independently reported strange lights moving across the night sky, a detail that made it into Soviet meteorological records of the period as an unexplained atmospheric phenomenon, filed without further comment, by people who had no professional reason whatsoever to coordinate a story with hikers they'd never personally met, and had no way of knowing were dying at that very same hour, on a mountain they'd likely never even heard of before that night. Then there's the clothing itself. When forensic teams later examined garments recovered from several of the dead, certain specific pieces tested positive for radioactive contamination at levels measurably above expected background exposure. No explanation for this appears anywhere in the official file, not even a tentative one. It's simply noted once, then quietly set aside, the way an investigator might note something that doesn't support the conclusion they've already decided to write, and choose not to dwell on it any further than absolutely necessary. There's also the matter of the journal's final entries themselves, which historians have returned to again and again precisely because of how ordinary they sound. Nothing in the last pages reads like people who sensed anything was wrong. There's mild griping about wet socks, a note about the wind picking up, a small disagreement about where exactly to pitch the tent that night, resolved without much drama. Whatever happened to this group happened suddenly enough that not one of them appears to have had any warning worth writing down beforehand. Then there's the order of death itself, reconstructed slowly and carefully from where and how each body was eventually found. The two found nearest the cedar, in their underwear, appear to have died first, from hypothermia, after losing or actively removing the very clothing that might have saved them. A kind of confused, irrational stripping behaviour that medical literature specifically associates with the final stages of severe cold exposure. The three found between the cedar and the tent seem to have died next, attempting what investigators believe was a desperate return uphill, perhaps trying to reach the others, perhaps trying to reach shelter that by then no longer meaningfully existed. The final 4, found months later in the ravine, suffered the most catastrophic injuries of anyone in the entire group, and were wearing extra clothing stripped from companions who had already died. A detail that, however grimly practical it may have been in the moment, is difficult to read about without feeling the raw desperation behind it. This entire sequence suggests something almost unbearable to sit with directly. A group of close friends splitting apart in real time, the living taking from the dead, some pressing forward with everything they had left and others simply giving out, across what was likely several hours in total darkness, in cold that kills exposed skin within minutes. And then there's the long silence that followed all of this. Lev Ivanov, the investigator who closed the case with that single, deliberately vague phrase about a compelling natural force, gave an interview decades later, long after retiring from a career that had quietly moved on to other, less haunting cases, in which he suggested he had personally believed something stranger than a simple avalanche was responsible. Something, he said plainly, he was never permitted to put into writing at the time, by unnamed people above him, whose specific identities he chose not to give, even decades later. He died without ever offering more detail than that single admission. Whether he privately meant a weapons test, some unusual meteorological event, or something he himself never managed to fully explain even to his own satisfaction, he left without saying more, and no surviving document anywhere in the archive carries a clearer answer written in his own hand. This, ultimately, is the layer underneath the layer. Not aliens, not some creature out of old Mansi folklore, but a government investigator, working inside a closed system with every conceivable reason to make an embarrassing case disappear quietly, hinting near the very end of his own life that the official story he had personally signed his name to was never actually the one he believed, and choosing even then, with genuinely nothing left to lose, to say only that much, and absolutely no more, leaving the rest for someone else to eventually piece together. 65 years on, the file sits open to anyone who wants to read it, scanned and translated, scattered across forums and documentaries and academic papers written by people who have spent careers trying to close the gap between the evidence and the explanation. The avalanche theory carries the most institutional weight now, endorsed by prosecutors and tested in simulations that account for the chest fractures without requiring anything stranger than physics and a poorly chosen campsite. It may well be correct. Snow does violent, unpredictable things on a slope angled the way Kholat Syakhl's was, and panic does strange things to people deciding, in pitch dark, whether to dig through a possible second collapse or simply run. The 2021 Swiss study was thorough in a way the original 1959 investigation never had the tools to be, modelling the slope angle, the snow density likely present that night, the placement of the tent relative to the terrain above it, and arriving at a number that, on paper, finally accounts for injuries that puzzled investigators for 60 years. But theories built to explain the injuries rarely explain everything else sitting in the same file. They don't explain why the ski track showed 9 people walking, not scrambling, in a pattern investigators on the scene described as orderly rather than panicked. They don't explain the radioactive clothing, noted once in the official record and never followed up, never retested, never folded into any of the modern simulations that have otherwise tried to account for every other physical detail. They don't explain the lights reported 60 kilometers away by people who had no reason to coordinate a story with hikers they never met, and who reported what they saw, independently, days before anyone connected their account to a missing group on a different mountain. And they don't fully explain why a Soviet investigator, decades after closing the case with a deliberately vague phrase, spent his retirement implying he'd never believed his own conclusion, a detail no simulation, however precise, can model away. There's also the matter of timing that tends to get lost in most retellings. The group's final scheduled check-in, by the loose timeline they'd agreed to before setting out, should have come days before searchers were even formally dispatched. And it didn't. A gap that, in a country with the kind of centralized infrastructure the Soviet Union maintained at the time, raises its own quiet questions about how quickly anyone in authority actually responded once it became clear something had gone wrong. Search efforts only began in earnest once worried family members started making inquiries on their own, contacting the institute directly when official channels offered nothing. That detail rarely makes it into either the avalanche account or the conspiracy accounts, perhaps because it serves neither narrative particularly well. It simply sits there, quiet evidence of an institution slow to act and slower still to explain why. Maybe all of it has one single answer, still undiscovered, sitting in some small detail nobody has connected yet. Maybe it has several smaller answers instead, each one mundane on its own, that simply happen to converge on the same slope on the same freezing February night. A small avalanche here, a coincidental light in the sky there, an old contamination source nobody thought worth mentioning because nobody asked the right question back in 1959. The Mansi who named that mountain long before any of this happened weren't being poetic. They avoided it specifically, in ways that predate Dyatlov's group by generations. They told outsiders not to climb it, in terms specific enough that Soviet ethnographers recorded the warning decades before 9 students ever pitched a tent there, dismissed at the time as harmless superstition, right up until someone has good reason to wonder if the people who lived there simply knew something the official maps never showed. There is also the matter of what was never properly investigated simply because nobody at the time thought to. No one tested the soil itself. No one returned to precisely map the contours of the slope until decades after the snow that actually mattered had long since melted and reformed dozens of times over. No one ever formally cross-referenced the missile range theory against actual launch logs from that exact period, because those logs, if they still exist anywhere, have never been declassified, and nobody with the real authority to request them seems to have tried particularly hard to get them. 65 years is a very long time for unasked questions to simply calcify into a kind of permanent unknowing, eventually mistaken for an answer nobody quite remembers ever failing to find. The tent itself is gone now. The bodies have long since been buried, most in a single Yekaterinburg cemetery, where visitors still occasionally leave flowers. 65 years after a search team first carried them down from a mountain, most of those visitors will never see in person. The investigators who originally handled the case are mostly dead now too. Their private notes and unspoken doubts buried right along with them, or scattered across an archive that took 30 years to open and decades more after that to properly digitize. What remains, in the end, is simply the file itself, thorough, contradictory, occasionally radioactive, sealed for 3 decades and then finally opened to a world that still hasn't agreed on what it actually proves. 9 people walked into deep snow on a mountain whose name meant, roughly, don't. They were careful people, the kind who kept meticulous shared journals and double-checked their own gear out of habit, the kind of people you'd reasonably expect to survive a winter trek precisely because they took it seriously enough not to take any unnecessary risks along the way. Something happened to them that night that still doesn't fit cleanly into any single explanation anyone has seriously offered since, official or otherwise. Not the careful avalanche models, not the missile theories, not even the quieter, more cautious accounts that try to weave several small explanations together into something that almost but never quite covers every single detail sitting in the file. The case is closed on paper, the way bureaucracies tend to close things that no longer have anywhere productive left to go, the way a closed government tends to close anything that has stopped being useful to keep open. It isn't actually finished, though. It just stopped being investigated by anyone left with the authority to keep asking why. And that quiet distinction between a case that's genuinely solved and a case that's simply been set down and walked away from is the one detail that every theory, every simulation, every retired investigator's deathbed hint has left completely untouched. Somewhere in that gap between closed and finished is exactly where 9 names, 1 mountain, and 65 years of half-answers continue to sit, quietly waiting for someone with both the access and the will to actually go looking again.